So I'm an Australian artist. I'm based in Brooklyn. I use 3D laser scanning to create video and prints and 3D printed sculpture. My work does not, in fact, engage with blockchain, but nevertheless, over the course of my career, I've been really interested in how we can use technology critically within the context of art history and within what you might think of as a more traditional sculpture and image-making practice. The end point of my work is usually a physical object, but I nevertheless aim to use the tech that gets me there against the grain and to challenge the assumptions and the blind spots that are inherent in its design. I'm also very interested in asserting my own embodiment and humanity in any interaction with any machine that I have, and exploring the ways that new imaging tools fail to capture the human body, and then in particular, as an artist, what the poetics of that failure might look like. So I trained as a photographer. I graduated from Goldsmiths College about 15 years ago, before the school had a new media department. But not long into my career in photography, I became very, very frustrated with the limitations of the medium and the current trend. This was the era of Andreas Gursky and the Düsseldorf School, these disembodied, huge kind of images of depopulated post-human spaces. And I was always really interested in working at ground level and in not making such grand claims for the technology that I was using. Simultaneously, I became really fascinated with 3D imagery, and it allowed you to create a virtual camera and virtual lights and virtual materials and kind of play photographer in this space where the real world physics didn't really apply. I enrolled at RMIT Spatial Information Architecture Lab in Melbourne in Australia to study 3D modelling, and a team of architects there were using 3D scanning and 3D printing to reconstruct Gaudi's famously unfinished Sagrada Familia. They were actually 3D scanning his original maquettes and then using those to create parametric models that were eventually 3D printed and then used in the reconstruction efforts. And that was my first intro to 3D. This was well before the buzz around 3D printing that's now kind of faded down. And I remember I asked the technician, what happens if you use this stuff wrong? What if you misuse it? And he goes, ugh, it's gross. You get these chunks, these floating gross chunks all over the place. So as an artist right away, I wanted to know what that looked like. I can talk about the scan without the video playing. So this is the scanner that I use in all my work. It uses a red laser beam and a video camera and a tracking magnet to create a digital 3D model of whatever it's pointed at. You have to work up close. As a scanner operator, you get right up very personal with your model and you choose what gets painted in and what's left out. The process felt like an extension of my work as a photographer because it still used light and a lens, and it felt like almost sitting for a Victorian era portrait. The person has to stay still and close their eyes, and to protect the laser is not eye safe. But that generated these other really strange emotional resonances. It looked particularly to me like a death mask, like a plaster death mask, where the skin is rendered in this, unfortunately, default white, and you lose all motion. These are some more of those chunks. So I started kind of sneaking into the lab, and I was working with the scanner after hours, and I was performing for it with my own body and with other models' bodies. The process was not quite generative, but it also wasn't really under my control, and it was endlessly surprising, like a performance for both the body and the machine. My favourite way to begin an artwork is to find a space where two incompatible things collide and to look at what happens from that collision. And so this was the perfect condition to create something unexpected. These are some of my very, very early experiments. So I also have training in the history of photography. And one thing that the scans brought up for me was this idea of the deathliness that ensues when we try and capture life. Historians of photography have talked about a photographic image of a person as a zombie or a reanimated corpse, a doppelganger. There's this Dorian Gray quality that is haunting where the the person in a photograph stays the same, whereas your real body just trudges onwards and ages towards the grave. New cameras and new scanning technology that's sold to us claims to capture life with ever more kind of veracity. But we all know this by now, the theory of the uncanny valley, that as technological imaging tools approach the perfect replication of the body, they actually become ever more upsetting and kind of horrifying. So the Polar Express, Final Fantasy, this was kind of the peak when people were talking about the uncanny valley. And animation has since really backed off, I think, on trying to capture the body because we just kind of can't do it without creating something really creepy. Some of my early prints, they were inspired by Victorian spirit photography. It's a really fantastic example to me of a very early critical use of technology. You're using something that's supposedly objective and used for evidence, but creating these ridiculous narratives with ghosts and floating faces and figures, and it's very hyperbolic and overblown and emotional. And I really connected with that, so these are my spirit photographs. These are large prints and installed in this gallery with a kind of tomb-like mausoleum kind of atmosphere. So I began to 3D print the work when the market opened up a little bit more to consumers around 2005, 2006. And getting the terrible glitchy scan data that I was working with was kind of a Herculean digital effort to actually materialize it, but I fought the upload systems and I won, and created these sculptural works that looked like deconstructed monuments or memorials. I was trying to create the sense of kind of a future artifact. These are all made from life, using real models, and each scan is made in a kind of 3 or 4 minute time span. I then started casting them in bronze to further kind of dialogue with traditional materials from the art world and from art history. But again, when you get up close, you see the digital build line and you see that this is a kind of machine-made artifact. So it's kind of a forgery and a fake, and that's the idea that I come back to a lot in my practice. This portrait in particular is one of my favourites that I've made. The model actually had the idea to do a triple scan where she would hold still, and then she would turn her head, I would scan her once, and then she'd turn and I'd scan her a third time. So this is an image of about 10 minutes in her life. Almost this kind of cubist sense of the accumulation of time that's frozen into a kind of still space. The kind of polygons and the glitch that run over her eyes and mouth are the result of my trying to ask my software to reconcile data that really doesn't make any sense, and it freaks out and generates this kind of fungus that just populates across her face, which I liked. But after making a lot of these kind of death masks and death head type portraits, I decided that I wanted to make some larger life-size sculptures of the body. I've always come back to making imagery of the human figure, and it's always been resonant to me in a way that nothing else can really capture, because when a viewer, there's so much of our brain is attuned to recognizing facial features. You know, we can recognize 10,000 people just walking, that we might bump into walking down the street. You recognize somebody's face from 10 years ago. You know, there is so much of our brain is so sensitive to the human face and the human body. And when that's broken, when that's kind of digitally damaged, I've always found that to be more poignant as a viewer than looking at a damaged scan of an object. So I wanted to continue working with the body, with the female body, and I wanted to look at ways that sculpture can kind of try and capture the past and try and create memorials. So I started particularly looking at funereal sculpture. This is from a book that inspired a whole body of work. It's called Saving Graces, and it's photographs of women in cemeteries. So there was this odd kind of phenomenon that happened where the specific memorials to men and the specific memorials to women were very somber, and they were these, you know, well-dressed, kind of sleeping, respectable figures. But within a cemetery, you would have these incredibly racy, nude, anonymous women. It's somehow okay, even though this is a religious space and a very solemn space. And they're enacting these kind of allegories of perhaps mourning and grief, but maybe they're in ecstasy. This very bizarre nexus of like memory and sex and death that I keep coming back to as an artist. So these kind of this thinking formed the cornerstone of a lot of my large work. Here's a more respectable lady in the cemetery. Also, the image of the reclining female figure became a very personal one for me, and it referenced a history, my own, which is now in the past, of chronic illness and disability. And there was a time when I was making these works where I was so ill, all I could really do was to kind of lie on the ground and be scanned. Like, I couldn't stand, I couldn't, you know, do anything really athletic. And as somebody who had been through every imaginable medical test and every imaginable medical imaging procedure, as a passive person, as a patient kind of submitting to the machine gaze, it felt very empowering, to use a kind of cheesy word, to be the person who was making these images and to be the person who was operating the machine and not the person who was having the machine operate on her. So these are some more of my kind of sleeping figures. This was actually a design for my own tomb, which was my most kind of tongue-in-cheek project. Like, I think there was like that Republican senator that did the same thing. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. It would have cost $50,000 to make in CNC milled marble, so this is a hypothetical project only. One day. And then lastly, I also wanted to think about this idea of the architectural fragment and the fake, because I spent so much time working with these digitally damaged objects, with kind of things that had been glitched in the software or glitched in the printer, and there was positive and negative space, and I was trying to think about how you represent that negative space once you get a digital artifact that becomes a physical object. You know, how do you piece it together, and how do you represent the pieces that are missing? So I started looking at archaeology, at this idea of kind of creating a figure in space where the negative is also activated. And I worked with a museum mount maker, the same museum mount maker that created the displays for the ancient art galleries at the Art Institute of Chicago, which is across the road from where this show was. And it had this same feel. It had a dark gallery, it had museum lights, it had these perfect pedestals. But then when you got up close, you saw that it wasn't damaged classical marble, and it wasn't an artifact that had been through war and you know, violence and unearthed and whatever. Again, it was plastic, it was a fake, it was a cheap material, it was endlessly replicatable. So I'm always trying to kind of toy with expectations, and really own the fact that I'm making plastic work, because I think you have to own it. This piece is called Memorial Bust of a Woman, Self-Portrait. And that was the installation. I also used, just incidentally, the same grey. I took a grey sample from Maya, which is the software that I created this in. So it was kind of a simultaneous physical recreation of a digital render, and also a nod to history. And the best compliment I had was from one of my classmates who walked in and said, "I feel like I'm standing in your computer right now, and it's really freaking me out." So my new series, which I've been working on for a couple of years, is called Protons. It again focuses on machine images of the female body, but how that transaction can create resistance that reveals the limits of representational technology. And in order to create the choreography for it, I mined a very specific and fairly disturbing kind of place in history. This is my photograph of the Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris. I recently visited after working on this project for a few years. Right now it's just a hospital. There's not a lot to see, but at its peak, I think during the French Revolution, it housed over 10,000 inmates. In the 19th century, many of its female patients were deemed hysterics. So this was a now discounted, but at the time massively prevalent diagnosis. And the lead doctor at the time of the Salpêtrière, Dr. Jean-Martin Charcot, was instrumental in kind of the invention of hysteria. It was a teaching hospital, so he would have patients reenact what he called a hysterical attack. If necessary, he would use very violent means to do this, including electric shock, or he had a device that was called an ovary compressor, which I don't even want to imagine what that was. Really, really pretty upsetting. And so on cue, they would go through this range of poses, which he and an artist working at the hospital developed. This bizarre choreography. Some of them are called the period of passionate attitudes, the period of clownism. But again, what was fascinating to me as somebody interested in technology was that the technology of photography was used to classify this and codify it. Technology was massively used at the Salpêtrière, and there's a book called The Invention of Hysteria that you can read if you're interested in delving more into that history. Again, it dovetailed with my interest in the way that technology that is sold to us as being truthful and objective, that's used, like 3D scanning, in military surveillance and intelligence in forensic capture and reconstruction, is used to try and codify something absurd. I mean, how can you represent madness? How can you visually capture madness? It's a fool's errand. I'm not the first artist to be making work on hysteria by any means. It's fairly well trodden. But nevertheless, I embarked on this project. I think actually Annalie was one of my models who is here too. This is from a residency I did at the Ace Hotel. Scanning, I worked with male and female models actually. And these are some of the resulting pieces. These are actually shown at iBeam in the last show that was at the Chelsea space. It was called New Romantics, the period of clownism, and the period of passionate attitudes. And I also began to integrate another kind of unintended artifact from the technical process, which was the 3D printed supports. They're actually generated by the software to hold up the piece. I've always been engaging with this question of what happens when you materialize something digital? How do you support it, and how do you prop it up when it comes out as an object into the real world and it's subject to the laws of physics and gravity? I kind of fell in love with this image because it seemed like something was flowing out of the woman's body, or kind of weeping, tears, and began to integrate that imagery of these kind of architectural supports into the bodies as they enacted these incredibly physically demanding hysterical poses. It became a way to kind of hold them up. But it also suggested the female body as a site of construction, of deconstruction, something under demolition, and they almost resembled these monuments or, like a building, like the female body as architecture. So these are some of my early sketches. And then the latest, this is the very latest version of it. These are a series of maquettes. And a life-size version of this piece is going to be shown at Bitform's Gallery in New York, opening October 26th, if anybody is in the city then. And that's about all. Thank you so much.